More than 100 years ago, a group of Seventh-day Adventists had a dream to take the gospel to the farthest corners of the earth. But how? Travel was slow, communication was limited, and the mission field seemed impossibly vast. That's when they came up with a bold idea: build a mission boat. With money raised by faithful church members, the Pitcairn was launched in 1890. It wasn't just a ship, it was a lifeline, carrying missionaries to remote islands in the Pacific. For nearly a decade, the Pitcairn opened doors for Adventist mission work, proving that when God calls, He also provides. As the mission grew, so did the need for support. In 1912, church leaders introduced something new: the 13th Sabbath offering. Every quarter, Adventists around the world would come together to give a special offering, dedicated to projects that would help spread the gospel where it was needed most. During the years, this offering has built places of learning, healing, and worship in every corner of the world. And it's still making a difference today. This quarter, part of the 13th Sabbath, or the quarterly mission project offering, will help launch a mission boat in Zambia. On the vast Lake Banweulu, there are villages with little access to transportation outside of their small islands. But soon, this mission boat will bring pastors and Bible workers and provide transport to the people who need it most. From a simple ship more than a century ago to a new mission boat today, the work goes on because of people like you. When you give to the 13th Sabbath offering, you're part of a story that started long ago and is still being written. So thank you. Thank you for giving. Thank you for believing in mission. And thank you for being part of what God is doing around the world. One offering, one project, one life at a time.
Good morning. Sounds like my microphone's working very well. How's everybody this Sabbath? Let's start with a prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for this Sabbath, this building that we can gather together in. We thank you for the passage in Exodus that we have to study today. It was a pretty identifying passage for the Israelites, one that they referred to many times again in the future. So we pray that you'll open our eyes, help us to see fresh revelations about who you are, and at the end of this study, may we find ways to apply what we learn in here to our lives. We pray all these things in your name. Amen. Okay, so the Sabbath School lesson started out this week with a short little story. It says that a farmer was trying to get his donkey to move, but the beast would not budge, so the farmer took a thick branch and walloped it. He again spoke to the donkey, who then started moving. Thank you. And when somebody came to the farmer and asked why that worked, he said, well, you first have to get the attention of the donkey. Putting aside the issue one might raise about cruelty to animals, there's a point to be made here, especially in the context of Exodus, of the Hebrews from Egypt. Moses had been given his marching orders and goes to Pharaoh with God's famous words, Shalach ami, which is, let my people go. Pharaoh, however, does not want to let God's people go. The scriptures never explicitly explain why Pharaoh was so reluctant, despite the military threat that the Egyptians feared the Hebrews might pose. Most likely, as is often the case, slavery, it was pure economics. They were cheap labor, and he didn't want to lose whatever economic advantages these slaves gave to him. Thus, he was going to need some persuasion, not only to get his attention, but also to change his mind. I want to open up with maybe another question just to get the brainstorming juices flowing. What were some other reasons why Pharaoh may have been reluctant to let the Hebrews go? There's probably more than just one reason.
I think you want the labor.
You want the labor, right? I think that's a big deal. No, that was a reason why, for example, in the American Civil War, a lot of southern states were reluctant to liberate the slaves. But I think there was, just as was in the Civil War, I think that Pharaoh may have had some other reasons, but labor definitely being one big one. Other ideas, what were reasons why Pharaoh was reluctant to let the slaves go? Or maybe, let me put this in a different way, why was Pharaoh reluctant to listen to Moses?
Moses was raised by the Egyptians.
That's true.
He probably didn't want Moses to take the labor away.
Moses was raised by the Egyptians, and so you could see it's like, well, is this, some ex-prince that wants to go and start, New Egypt out somewhere else in Midian, for example? That's an interesting point. You were going to say something.
Yeah, they had a lot of gods.
Hmm.
And I think, he had a big ego, and so by him letting this God, which he didn't know who that was, even though it showed marvelous signs and wonders, he was so resistant against it. It was like, you're outshining my God. And so I think there was a lot of that going on. And then from what I read, he also was concerned about them joining forces with other people, and then it would be a big number that come against Egypt and overpower them. And so there's a lot of this.
Let me repeat for the people online. One, you mentioned that the Egyptians worshipped many gods. I think the lesson said as many as 1,500 gods. I have no idea how you keep count. I can hardly remember the capitals of all 50 United States, and that's only 15. This is 30 times more than that. You also mentioned that Pharaoh himself was a rather proud person. He was widely regarded as a god king, right? So he was a god in human flesh, and he basically anything he said go. And so when Moses comes after being in the wilderness for 40 years and just starts making demands, this rubs Pharaoh the wrong way, saying, "Who are you to tell me, the ruler of the world, what to do?" And then third, you mentioned that the Israelites were very large in number. You see back in Exodus 1, the Egyptians were beginning to commit infanticide, mass killing of children, because they were worried about the Hebrew nation becoming large enough that it could start an internal rebellion. I had never thought of what you had just said, which was they might go and join some other nation and ally themselves against Egypt and overthrow the Pharaoh. So yeah, all good points. Any other points before we move on? What were possible motivations that Pharaoh may have had that would have made him reluctant to listen to Moses? I think we've touched on most of the key ones. Okay, very good. So when we open up our Bibles and we start looking at the saga of the story of Moses and Aaron, what's the first sort of opening remarks? Like whenever there's a debate and there's two parties that are talking to each other, they will oftentimes premeditate their opening remarks. They'll try to structure their argument in a way that they can be persuasive and get their main thesis across and lay out what they want to do early and set the tone for the debate. How is that tone set between Pharaoh and Moses? Thank you. Let's see here. Who still needs some? Here you go.
Thank you.
Yep. Moses' first interaction with Pharaoh. What is said? How does it go? You want one or two? Two. Okay. Okay. I can separate these. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to hold on to one. Thank you. All right, first interaction between Moses and Pharaoh. What's said, what's done?
who's this God?
Yes.
He doesn't know his God. Is that what you're referring to?
Yep. So yeah, so you're saying he shows up, let my people go. Pharaoh asks, who is this God? And what does Moses and Aaron do?
Is that when you're referring to when they did the rod?
Yeah, they take the rod and they throw it down, and it turns into a serpent. Now, can anybody remember, the lesson actually pointed out a couple interesting things. What are the significances of a serpent in Egyptian culture? Did anybody pick that up this week's lesson? So there were two. Yeah, it was called the Uraeus of Wadjet, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. My understanding is that it was a symbol. The little serpent on their crown was a symbol of of Lower Egypt. If you look at a map of modern-day Egypt, you could separate it, into a northern part and a southern part. And the Egyptians called the northern part Lower Egypt, and they called the southern part Upper Egypt. And so, yeah, their maps were upside down. For example, also the Hebrews, they saw, let's see here, if you were to draw a map in Hebrew times west, the Mediterranean would be at the top of the map. So west was up for them. So the Egyptians, south was up for them. So the serpent on the top of the crown represents Lower Egypt, and the Pharaoh wearing the serpent is asserting his sovereign right over that land. For example, I think if you also look at this picture of Tutankhamun I've put here, on his crown, he has not only the serpent on the right-hand side, but just to the left of it, at least the way that we're looking at, there's a vulture, and the vulture represents the right to rule Upper Egypt. And so Tutankhamun was wearing that to show his unification. But God sends Aaron, and he says, here's going to be the sign that you show to Pharaoh. You're going to take this staff, and you're going to throw it on the ground, and that staff is going to turn into a cobra. And that cobra, to the Pharaoh, he's going to interpret it as Moses is asserting that God has a right to Lower Egypt. And meanwhile, Pharaoh is sitting there with a cobra on his crown, where Pharaoh is asserting a right to rule Lower Egypt. And so when the staff turns into a serpent, Pharaoh then calls in his magicians. The magicians walk into the room, and apparently I think that there might have been some briefing behind the scenes saying, can you guys match this miracle that Aaron has done? Now, apparently in modern days, and also I've been told it was practiced in ancient times, snake charmers have found a way that if you pinch a cobra right behind the neck, that puts into a catatonic state where the whole thing kind of just stiffens up and holds really still. And so there have been, I guess, throughout the ages, different snake charmers that would walk around with a real snake as if it were a staff. And then when they wanted to, they could, throw it on the ground. And of course, once the pinch is released, then it starts moving around. And then they're able to quickly go in and grab the snake again. It becomes a rod again. And so it seems one of two things happened. Either this trick was being portrayed by the magicians to take real snakes, walk into the room pretending that they were rods, and then say, ooh, look, my staff of wood turned into a snake, when really it was just sleight of hand. Or other people have suggested that this was a miracle enabled by demonic powers. Throughout the Bible, you will find places where God refers to, for example, in Daniel chapter 10, the prince of Persia. He's not referring to a literal human being that's the prince of Persia. He's referring to a demonic force that had been given or assigned sovereignty over that region of the world, and that prince of Persia would influence kings to do things according to that demon's power. You see also similar wording in Ezekiel 28, Psalms 82, and there's a couple passages in Deuteronomy that also say similar things. And so it's possible that when God sends Aaron in to say, these Hebrew people are mine, I've called them by my name, I'm calling my children back, that Satan is using Pharaoh to try to replicate the miracle to say, not so quick, God, in the great controversy, I also have certain rights over this land, and I'm not going to let them go without a fight. So you have these snakes on the ground. What happens? Aaron eats all of the other snakes. Now, there's an ancient Egyptian myth about a snake god named Nehebkau. And one of the myths about this snake was that this snake gained supernatural powers of immunity from water, magic, and fire by eating 7 other cobras. And so when Aaron's rod starts slithering around and devouring, swallowing up the other 7 serpents, what the message is to Pharaoh is, yes, you might assert a claim to dominance, but Aaron's cobra is swallowing up all of the Egyptian cobras. And so there is clear evidence now on the ground that whatever authority Pharaoh had asserted has to stand subservient to God's authority. And so, of course, at the end of it, Aaron picks up his rod. The 7 magicians that walked in with their snakes have to walk out without snakes now. And throughout the rest of the plague story, as you read through the next few chapters, over and over again, God instructs Moses to go out and, wave his staff, strike the Nile with his staff. And every time Pharaoh goes and he sees Aaron and Moses, that rod that swallowed up the 7 snakes is over and over and over again being used as a symbol to say, you said that you ruled Egypt. No, I own those snakes now. They're now in Aaron's hand, which I think is a pretty hardball move. We have a couple handouts for those of you guys who got here a few minutes ago. We can pass those out. All right, so I want to now pivot, and let's take a look at the back here. I tried to make the font as big as I could, but on the back you'll see I made a little spreadsheet. It enumerates the 10 plagues. I start with 0 because the serpents being thrown down in the throne room was not really a plague, so that's just kind of a preamble. And then I have the passage in Exodus where it happens, a summary of basically what was happening there. And one of the things that I found was interesting in the lesson was that they were treating these plagues not as God just, pummeling Pharaoh to convince him to let them go, but it was God actually saying, I am going to declare war on idolatry. And each plague was specifically targeted against a chief Egyptian god to show that that god was unable to stop the true God's claim over Egypt. And so, of course, we said that this first one, Wadjet, was this god that represented the rule over Lower Egypt. And in Pharaoh's throne room, God gains a victory over that false god. And for example, then the Nile turning to blood, there were 2 gods, for example, here that were being challenged. One was Hapi, the goddess of the Nile, and Osiris, the goddess of life. And then when the frogs come out, they had a frog-headed fertility god, Heket. And you can see down the list other gods that were listed there. The next column in the handout, we're going to spend some time discussing this question. But who was hardening was God responsible for hardening Pharaoh's heart? Was Pharaoh responsible for hardening his own heart? What was the interchange between those? We'll come back and we'll explain the color coding of that later. In the next chart here, next column in the chart, you'll see there are these Hebrew words transliterated. In the King James Bible, when you go through and you read that Pharaoh's heart was hardened, the word is always hardened, but in the Hebrew, there's actually 3 different words that are used somewhat interchangeably throughout. We'll talk about that. The next column also shows what was the mood or the background in Pharaoh's court for each plague, and we can discuss how those evolve over time. And on the far right-hand side, I tried to put Pharaoh's reaction to Moses in each plague. Okay, so Moses asserts God's basic request, let my people go so that they can offer sacrifices in the wilderness. Pharaoh refuses. Moses and Aaron walk out with all the snakes. And the next day, when Pharaoh gets up, I guess, to bathe or do whatever his morning routine is by the water, Moses and Aaron, I presume, call out from the other side of the lake saying, hey, Pharaoh, watch this. And he strikes the Nile. What I think is interesting here is that even though these are all plagues, it seems that God is trying to ease on the pressure and not just completely obliterate Egypt in one fell swoop. I think it says in, where is it? I think it's in chapter 10. No, it's in chapter 9:13. It might actually be worthwhile for us to turn there. Let's take a look at chapter 9:13. Go ahead and take your Bibles out. I'm going to ask for a volunteer to read when you get there so that I'm not doing all the talking. Exodus 9:13.
Then the Lord said to Moses, "Rise up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh and say to him, 'Thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go, that they may serve me. For this time I will send all my plagues on you and your servants and your people, so that you may know that there is no other like me in all the earth. For if by now I had put forth my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, you would then have been cut off from the earth.'"
Okay, very good. Yeah, so what he's saying in that last phrase that Dr. Lowe said, God is saying, if I had wanted to, I could have completely wiped you out right now. If I wanted my people to come out of Egypt and I thought you were in my way, I could have just neutralized you. There would just be a little greasy puddle where you guys used to live, and I would just take all my people out and take all your stuff. But I have a different motive in mind. I want to demonstrate both to the Egyptians, I want to demonstrate to the world the utter futility of your faith in your gods. And that's one of the reasons why God, rather than just dropping a nuke on Pharaoh, he wants to meter out the plagues little by little to demonstrate to the whole world several points. So we start out with this, miracle of the serpents, and if you, I can't state with any authority which of the two interpretations before is true, whether they came in with real snakes or whether they came in with rods and made them look as if they were snakes by some sleight of hand. If it was rods that were made to look by snakes, then up until this point, there has been no casualty, no loss of life, and if it was just a sleight of hand of snakes, it was just wood that was getting eaten, right? No animal cruelty so far. If it was snakes, I know very few people that are, lose sleep and cry when a snake dies. I know some, but most people don't mind when a snake dies. So far, in the extraction out of Egypt, there's been very little there's been no shedding of blood, there's been very little tears, just an initial volley between Pharaoh and Moses. The next thing that happens is that the river turns to blood. And here, there's no Pharaoh's not dying, the Egyptians aren't dying. The only thing that dies is, it says that the fish die. In the ancient world, though, they believed that there were different, hierarchies of life. So fish and insects were kind of this lower life form, and so if they died, it wasn't as catastrophic as if, for example, a lamb died. And if a lamb died, it wasn't as bad as if a human died. And so God is still keeping the pressure. Well, he's got the pressure strong, but the loss of life is very low here. Now, the Egyptian magicians, they are trying to assuage Pharaoh and say, what Moses is doing, last time he came in here, he turned a rod into a serpent. We could do that too. We can also do this with the water. So in my mind, I imagine this group of magicians coming over, and they're holding the water, and they're doing like this whole hocus pocus thing, and Pharaoh's focusing on one hand when there's another hand sneaking some dust into it, and it's like, oh look, it's blood now. I imagine that Pharaoh might have been a smart and clever guy, and I imagine that Pharaoh may have had some suspicion that the magicians, it says in the Hebrew that they were practicing these secret arts. So the etymology itself seems to imply deception. And I think that Pharaoh himself knew that there was probably some funny business going on with some of these magician tricks that had happened before, but I imagine that Pharaoh in his pride wanted to find any excuse that he could latch onto as a intellectual, logical reason why he was correct to resist what were clearly supernatural signs. And so when the Egyptians say, oh, look, we can do it too, I think Pharaoh latched onto that. The next plague is when frogs, God comes and he commands frogs to come out of the river. And what I think is interesting here, I can imagine how, staffs turn into serpents if you've got this catatonic sort of trick. Okay, sure. And, sprinkling dust into water, okay, fine. I don't know how you get frogs to come out of nowhere, because the Egyptians, it says that the magicians were able to find a way to duplicate the frogs coming out of the Nile. Now, you can pull rabbits out of the hat. I don't know how that works, but apparently they were able to go to Pharaoh and convince him, oh, this miracle of frogs coming out of the Nile, that is not a God-only act. We too can do it. And perhaps Pharaoh was satisfied with that, but the next verse when you read in Exodus chapter 8 is that Pharaoh then goes to Moses and says, can you please get all of these frogs to go away? Now, I assume what this means is that there is probably, not written in the Bible, but we can imply it between the words that are said. The magicians say, look, here's a whole bunch of frogs that we made. And Pharaoh's like, great, now get rid of them. And they're like, well, can't really get rid of the frogs. Abracadabra, die frogs. And the frogs are still hopping around. And so after maybe 24 hours a week, I don't know how long this happened, eventually frustrated Pharaoh summons Moses and says, can you please get rid of all the frogs? And Moses says, well, what time do you want them to go away? And we could imagine that if God had just made all the frogs die immediately, Pharaoh could have said, well, that was coincidence, right? That really wasn't God doing anything. But Moses comes here and he gives Pharaoh an opportunity to set a time, and God honors the time that Pharaoh sets so that there's no question that it was truly God that got rid of all the frogs. And once again, there's all the frogs die. Egypt stinks, but so far there's been no loss of any serious property or no loss of life. As far as I know, frogs primarily eat things that humans don't care about, like insects and, mosquito larvae and other things. And so these things have mostly been an annoyance to the smell, but so far there's been no loss of human life. And it seems that God is increasingly picking signs that are harder and harder and harder for the Egyptians to counterfeit. So we come to Exodus chapter 8, verse 16, and now God is challenging the earth god. And the earth god God calls out of the dust a whole bunch of gnats and lice. And it's said in Exodus that the magicians tried to duplicate this. So I imagine that they had, look, I can pull a frog out of a hat trick, and then they were trying to pull the lice out of a hat. And I don't know if whether they didn't have small enough tweezers or what, but they eventually go to Pharaoh and they say, we cannot imitate this. This has now gone beyond the ability of the technology of Egypt to counterfeit. This truly is the finger of God. And what I find interesting here is that from here on out, throughout the rest of the plagues, you're going to find these magicians of Pharaoh become less and less enthusiastic about Pharaoh's stubborn rebellion, and they're going to start drifting towards Moses' side to the point where at the end of it, they're going to be pleading Pharaoh to let the Israelites go. Pharaoh, at this point in the story, he agrees to let the Israelites go. And he says, I'm willing to let you guys go out and do your sacrifice, but I want you guys to remain inside of the boundaries of Egypt. So presumably, Pharaoh had, border guards that were enforcing customs and whatever. And Pharaoh knew as long as these Hebrews stay inside of my territory, I can eventually pull them back and have them keep on working. I don't lose anything by having them do their sacrifices. Moses responds, though, and says, oh, okay, so this is going to come later, I think. At some point, he says you have to be within Egypt or nearby. Oh, yeah, okay, it's here. Moses agrees. Moses says, we will only go if you allow us to go 3 days out into the wilderness, because the types of sacrifices that we want to do are going to involve animal sacrifices that the Egyptians consider abominable. And if we're doing our sacrifices within the territory of Egypt, you guys are going to stone us on the spot. And so Pharaoh eventually says, okay, go nearby Egypt, and then as soon as the frogs go away, or the flies go away, Pharaoh breaks his promise. So the next one, we have the death of the livestock. And this is the second of two. So the flies was the first plague, the livestock is the second plague, where these are now plagues that are only affecting the Egyptians. The first three affected presumably Goshen, where the Hebrews were living, and the Egyptians. But now we start to have the death of livestock, which is now presenting a serious economic harm, right? It's no longer just, frogs eating flies and the Nile being blood, so you have to dig water. This is now beginning to actually sting permanently the economy of Egypt. There's no recorded reaction by Pharaoh here other than his heart is being hardened. Number 6, God is striking against the Egyptian gods of healing, of medicine, etc. And so Moses, I think, releases something into the air that goes out and causes boils among the Egyptians. And now you can see the magicians themselves are being affected. So it seems with each plague now at this point, the threat of the plague is getting closer and closer and closer to Pharaoh. So in the past, it was just, oh, well, the river is blood, but I'm going to have somebody bring me a bucket of clean water from a well that they just dug. And now the magicians are no longer able to come close to him because they are so affected by the boils. It doesn't say that necessarily Pharaoh has the boils, although I've seen that in a number of different movies and cartoons. But you can see that that every plague now is beginning to close into Pharaoh, and his little circle of safety is shrinking. Plague number 7, this one is very interesting. I think it's probably worth us reading. My notes say Exodus 9:13. Dr. Lowe read some of that. I want to keep on continuing. Can we have another volunteer start in verse 16? And the good place to stop would be 20. No. 13. Did I label this wrong? Thunder and hail. Where's thunder and hail? I labeled this wrong? Swords is the 8th. Magicians. Okay. Okay. 18. Yeah, 18. All right. So let's start in 18 and let's go to 21. Sorry about that.
Behold, tomorrow about this time I will cause very heavy hail to drop. I'm sorry. About this time I will cause very heavy hail to rain down, such as has not been in Egypt since its founding until now. Therefore, send now and gather your livestock and all that you have in the field. For the hail shall come down on every man and every animal which is found in the field and is not brought home, and they shall die. Now he who feared the word of the Lord among the servants of Pharaoh made his servants and his livestock flee to the houses.
And 21, sorry.
But he who did not regard the word of the Lord left his servants and his livestock in the field.
All right, can you guys see the shift that's happening inside of Pharaoh's court? You know, it starts out, Moses comes in, and everybody's like, oh yeah, who are you, Moses? We all have our staffs. We all have sovereignty over Egypt. They lose their staffs. They're, now got scars from the boils. Some of them have lost livestock in the 5th plague. And now God's saying, there's going to be a hailstorm around this time tomorrow. And God and Moses is coming and saying, we are telling you ahead of time. You have already seen 7, if you include plague 0. You've now seen 7 examples of God's sovereignty. You have long since stopped being able to counterfeit this. These plagues are going to keep on coming until Pharaoh repents. However, in Pharaoh's court, you can see the Egyptians are, beginning to lose things, and God is saying, even if you are not Pharaoh, you are suffering because of this, and I'm giving you guys an opportunity to protect your assets. So this time tomorrow, it's going to hail in the fields. Bring your slaves and bring your livestock into shelter, and you will be okay. And I can imagine you've got, some of Pharaoh's household saying, oh yeah, there's no way this is going to happen. God's not going to follow through. And the other guy's just like, God's kind of come through 7 times out of 7 so far. I'm going to go home right now. I'm going to ask my stuff to come inside, and we'll just see how this goes. And the next day, everybody comes in, reports to work at 8 a.m. And there's some people said, so, did you bring yours in yesterday? Did you bring yours in yesterday? And, people are beginning to see where things stand. The people who are rebelling against God are becoming poorer and poorer. And the people who are listening to God, heeding the word of the Lord, are holding onto their property. And later on, as you read through the story in the chapters that follow, it says that when Israel came out of Egypt, there was a mixed multitude that came with them. Some of the Egyptians that had been watching these plagues decided that they no longer wanted to stay in Egypt, but they wanted to come with Israel. Now, of course, when they make the decision to leave, that Pharaoh is still alive. And so I imagine that they were saying, well, I have two options here. I have a Pharaoh here that's repeatedly getting pummeled by this true God, and I have Moses and Aaron who are, worshiping this God, so I myself have a choice as to who I'm going to follow. So that's an interesting development with plague number 7. Now, what's interesting, the next morning, when the livestock, are all dead, Pharaoh calls Moses and he says, "This time have I sinned, and I'm going to let you guys go." But then he breaks his promise. So it's interesting, this is the first time that Pharaoh makes an admission of his own guilt. And of course, it's not a lasting admission of guilt, but you can see that he's beginning to realize that he is no longer the top dog in this situation, even though he wants to be. I think the lesson also was tying links, for example, to Judas, who, when he saw that Jesus had been condemned, he goes into the, before the Pharisees, and he takes the money and says, "Take it back." And the Pharisees, say, "What is that? This is blood money. We can't accept it." And he goes out. And the Desire of Ages says this wasn't really a true repentance out of a sense of overwhelming guilt and shame, but it was a wanting to avoid the punishment. And so I think that Pharaoh may have had some similar spiritual experience happening here. And I imagine that we could find other such cases in Scripture as well. Okay, so the next one that happens is the plague of locusts. And with this plague, the Egyptians are finally getting to this point where you're saying, "Pharaoh, are you out of your mind?" I think the language that's used is Egyptian is ruined. Not, like, if you keep on doing this, Egyptian will be ruined. But they're saying, at this point, we're toast. There's really nothing left to lose. Let these guys go. And before the plague happens, Pharaoh agrees to let them go, but what's his condition? Only the males go. Why does Pharaoh only want to let the males go?
The women are better workers.
For those of you online, they said the women are better workers. I think that's great. Maybe. In Exodus chapter 1, they do say when the Pharaoh asks why are all these Hebrew boys still being born, the response is, well, the Hebrew women are pretty hardy women, and the babies come out right away. So maybe there's some truth to that. But also, Pharaoh knows that the Hebrew men are less likely to go off and cause a revolt if there are hostages still back in Egypt. And so Moses actually responds with something that I think is, it makes sense, but I think there's also a theological point with Moses' response. Let's go ahead and read that. Which verse is this? Chapter 10. Where does Moses explain why it can't be just the men? Yeah, I think it's verse 11. Yeah, verse 9. Verse 9. Can somebody read that? Exodus 10:9.
Moses said, "We shall go with our young and old, with our sons and our daughters, with our flocks and our herds. We shall go, for we must hold a feast to the Lord."
And then the Pharaoh responds in verse 10, "Then he said to them, the Lord had better be with you when I let you and your little ones go. Beware, for evil is ahead of you. Not so. Go now, you who are men, and serve the Lord, for that is what you desired." And they were driven from the Pharaoh's presence. So what Moses is saying is that for this festival, for this religious practice that they're going to do in the wilderness, it's not just enough for the men to go. The God of Israel is a God that doesn't want just the man in the family to worship him and the man to, be the only guy that has a relationship with God, but the religion is such that the old and the young, the sons and the daughters, women and men, all are called to participate in the religious experience of the nation. And just, I'd never seen that presented before until I was studying this lesson. I thought that was pretty cool. That was an inclusive religion, unlike many of the other religions that were around in that time. And that was one of the reasons why Moses was able to tell the Pharaoh, no deal, I can't compromise on this. Both women and men have to be allowed to participate in this ritual. Okay, so the locusts come, and one more point about the locusts. My dad was recently telling me a story about, I can't remember all the details, but it was about a family who, I guess, had recently become Christians, and one day a locust swarm comes and consumes all of the grain in their area, and they're like, oh no, we're going to be poor because we don't have any money left. We don't have any crops left. And then God gives them the idea, remember what John the Baptist in the wilderness ate? Locusts and wild honey, right? So they're just like, well, why don't we just gather up all the locusts? The food is still there, it's just inside the locust. And they would just have these bags of grasshoppers that then they brought to the market and they sold. So they didn't get profit from the agriculture, but they got profit from the locusts. And apparently all of their neighbors had also had their crops. I mean, this is a great story for the family. It's a horrible story for everybody else. But they went to the market, and they were the only ones that had the idea to gather up the locusts. And by the time that they were in the market selling their locusts, a strong wind had come and blown all the rest of the locusts into the, downwind or whatever. And so I think when you read here, it says, verse 14 of chapter 10, the locusts went up over all the land of Egypt and rested on the territory of Egypt. They were very severe. Previously there had been no such locusts as they, nor there any such after them, for they covered the whole face of the earth. They ate every herb of the land, ate all the fruit of the trees which the hail had left. There remained nothing green on the trees or on the plants throughout all of Egypt. Pharaoh says he has sinned. And then verse 19, and the Lord turned a very strong west wind, which took the locusts away and blew them into the Red Sea. And there remained not one locust in all the territory of Egypt. So I had in the past read this as like, oh, God got rid of all the locusts. Now the Egyptians are happy because there's no locusts left. But I'm just like, actually, this is actually the worst case scenario for the Egyptians, because if the locusts had remained, they could have eaten the locusts. But this is like, yeah, they ate everything and then they blew off into the Red Sea. And maybe the Hebrews had some of those locusts for snacks on the way out of the Exodus. Okay, then there's the plague of darkness. And after the plague of darkness, Pharaoh calls Moses and says, the men and the children can go, but your animals have to stay back. And Moses says, God hasn't told us exactly what he wants us to sacrifice. We haven't received that instruction yet from Mount Sinai. We will only know once we get there, so we have to bring all the animals just in case. We can't just bring what we need to sacrifice because we don't know yet. And so he says, no compromise. And at this point, Pharaoh is so upset that he says, I never want to see you again. Next time I see you, you're going to die. And then, of course, the next plague is the death of the firstborn. And if you look at the sequence of events, Pharaoh is losing all of his crops, all of his agriculture. He's losing his health. And it comes to the point where even Pharaoh within his own household, he's lost the most important family member for him would be his heir to the throne, and he's lost that. And I wonder if in Pharaoh's mind he had been tracking his circle of safety shrinking, so he realizes if there is to be another plague, it could be me that dies. And perhaps that's his thinking when he finally goes and says, take your men, your women, your old people, your young people, your wives, your children, your daughters, and all your animals, and get out of here. And the irony is that he had already flipped his mind several times, and he goes out and he tries to win them back. And in that final one, it isn't the plague that kills him. It's his own hubris going into the Red Sea that kills him. And so Pharaoh is ultimately a casualty of his own pride. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about God hardening Pharaoh's heart versus Pharaoh hardening his own heart. What are things that people have? This is a question that's long, what's the word, to puzzled. Yeah, it's long puzzled many Christians and Jews and Muslims. Why is it that in some places God hardens Pharaoh's heart? Why is it in other places Pharaoh hardens his own heart? I've color-coded it here that in the green, these are places where Pharaoh hardens his own heart. And I color-coded this green because in my worldview and thinking, Pharaoh hardening his own heart seems to fit nicely with my idea of free will, that God doesn't come in and like force people to rebel against him. So this is green. These are verses I don't have to try hard to harmonize. There's verses that say Pharaoh's heart was hardened. And you can say, well, it's passive in the Hebrew. That could either mean that Pharaoh's heart was being hardened by the situations around him, but also Hebrew allows for a divine passive construct, which means that it was God that was hardening his heart. So these are verses that, you could maybe weasel your way out of if you're explaining it. But then there's, a number of verses here where the Lord hardens Pharaoh's heart. And then at the bottom, I've got a number of other places in Exodus outside of this chart and in Romans in the New Testament that says that it was God that hardened Pharaoh's heart. So, I don't know. How have you guys tried to harmonize these things in the past?
They're both true.
Both true. Can you expound a little bit more on that?
Well, God brings forth the circumstance or truth, and it's Pharaoh's response that he either submits or he hardens. He resists. So, obviously, if Pharaoh wasn't given the choice or the chance, the opportunity to choose, God is the one that brings that. So in a way, you could say, well, yeah, God was hardening his heart in that he brings forth the choices and circumstances for which, God is being very patient with Pharaoh, actually. Now when you look at it, like 10 times, he gives them a chance to acknowledge God when he started out with who is God,
right?
To finally acknowledging who God is and is against, superior to all the other gods of Egypt. So, it's like if you put if you turn on the oven, you could say, and you put a material in the oven and it hardens, you can say, well, yeah, I hardened that dough. Or you say, well, the dough got hardened by being in the oven, So, yeah, I think both can be true.
Right. I think the lesson used the metaphor of God would be the sunshine, and Pharaoh is clay. And because of the way that clay is, the material properties, when it's exposed to sunshine, it hardens the clay. So it's not God. What is it? Is it the sun that's hardening the clay? Well, if I had put butter there, the same set of circumstances would have melted the butter. As I was studying for this, I was thinking, why is it that God, it says I'll put this at the bottom here. Why is it that God raises up Pharaoh? In Exodus 9:16, it says, and Romans 9:17, it says that God had raised up Pharaoh to be the king of Egypt at this time so that God could send all these plagues. What do we do with that? He knew what?
He knew how much pride he would have.
He knew how much pride Pharaoh would have. But yes, I was sitting here this morning, I was asking myself, if God wanted to get the Hebrews out of Egypt, and it's not God's plan that anybody should die, God ultimately doesn't really relish from sending suffering and destruction. He can, he certainly has the power to. Why couldn't God just put like this pliable, pushover, easygoing, malleable, guy in office in Egypt, and then Moses comes there and says, hey, smack, 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 let my people go. And the guy's like, oh, okay, go ahead. Why did God pick somebody who is going to be really obstinate, who is going to say, no, I'm going to die on this hill, you can't have any of the Hebrews? Showing the world? Can you say more? Showing the world his power. Let's pull on that string a little bit. Let's investigate that.
I think he was trying to also share with other nationalities his sovereignness and not, to he's a loving, forgiving God, and so he's not going to come in there and wipe them all out, and because like you said, he could have done that, so I think that was maybe the reason.
Well, obviously, other nations heard about it because by the time they get to Jericho, they already know what God has been doing for the children of Israel.
Right.
So this was a kind of a witness to the rest of the world. I mean, here you're taking down the top superpower in the world at that known time, and that had to have a telling effect on the surrounding nations.
Yeah, 40 years after the event, when the spies go into Jericho, Rahab says, I forget the metaphor, but she's basically like, our loins have no strength. So they're like, our knees are shaking together because we have heard of the things that your God had done to the Egyptians and to, I think there was another nation on the way over. That said, we know that we're hosed. We just have a wall and we're feebly trying to hide behind it. Another place where, I think to what the point you were saying, that for centuries afterwards, people remember this. Do you guys remember when the Philistines captured the Ark of the Covenant in battle? And they took it as a token of their championship into their temple. And then, of course, I think like the hands were falling off and the statue fell over, and then a bunch of people started to get tumors. And 1 Samuel 6:6, they say, why then do you harden your hearts as the Egyptians, and Pharaoh hardened their own hearts when God did mighty things among them? Did they not let the people go that they might depart? And so it was a lesson to say, hey, don't mess with this God of Israel, because whatever idols we have, he's better. Do not harden your hearts. And that same word for harden your hearts actually shows up a number of times in the New Testament book of Hebrews. Don't harden your hearts like it was done in the Old Testament. I think one thing that helped me as I was studying this, reconcile this, is that God did not set up Moses in this situation to go into Egypt and find a king that was a perfectly nice, wonderful person who minded his own business and did everything right, and then God goes in there and poisons his heart to turn him into an evil monster, right? I think what's more likely is that the Pharaoh of Egypt was already a tyrant. And this harmonizes with a reading of Exodus 9 and Romans 9 that says that God had raised up this Pharaoh, had allowed this person to come into power. And I don't know, in modern days, we'll read about how tyrants come into power, and they oftentimes will poison a brother or murder an uncle or something like that. But there's a lot of nuance and intrigue to how they come into power. And God is sovereign. He sets up kings and he takes kings down. And perhaps God said, I have a unique chance in history while my chosen people are living in Egypt to allow a wicked person controlled by Satan. I'm going to step back and allow that to happen, and then use that person, once he comes into the peak of his power, as an object lesson. It's not that God's saying, I'm going to put you up here and then I'm going to beat you because I'm a cruel tyrant. It's saying, this is what Satan and sin ultimately lead to. This is what idolatry ultimately leads to. This is what 1,500 gods ultimately leads to. This is what slavery and infanticide and all the other wicked things that were practiced by Egypt ultimately leads to. I'm going to take the guy that is the prime model of this. If you look up who is Satan's representative on earth? Who is the most powerful person that Satan has set up? I'm going to allow him to reach the top that he can reach. And once he is there, I'm going to bring Moses, who is my guy up here, and I'm going to allow the two of them to play out the cosmic conflict. When behind the scenes, it's really God and Satan playing it out. And God, had been forming and shaping Moses' character for decades in the wilderness. And Satan had been grooming this Pharaoh for, I don't know how old he was, but let's say decades in Egypt. And when they play out, like Dr. Lowe pointed out, it's not so much that God is going in and poisoning Pharaoh's heart, but he is creating circumstances that showcase when you have fully devoted your life to idolatry, even the clearest manifestation of the goodness, the mercy, the long-suffering of God turns you more and more against that God. Another thing that you can see in this pattern is that this chart starts out with yellows and greens. So either it's a Pharaoh's heart was hardened, which is passive, it's ambiguous who the actor is, or Pharaoh is the one that's hardening his own heart. So in the beginning, the way that Exodus is being written, most of the culpability is on Pharaoh. So it shows that there's a time in his life where he seems to have a lot of free will that he can choose, am I going to accept God? Am I going to reject God? But after Pharaoh has gone down to rejecting God 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 times, the language now shifts to it's now God, an external agent, that's hardening Pharaoh's heart. And so there comes a point in it where Pharaoh has kind of reached the point of no return. And we're told that in the end of time, there will come a point when there's, near the end of the world, God's character will be so clearly manifested that there will no longer be a middle ground. Everybody's mind will be fully made up for or against God. There will only be two camps, and it'll be very clear on what side of the great controversy everybody wants to land. And you can see these magicians. There's no longer a middle ground. There's no longer somebody saying, well, I'm on Pharaoh's side. Everybody's either fully on Pharaoh's side or everybody's fully on the Israelite side. And all the Israelites have left with the mixed multitude, and Pharaoh is here with his army going out to persecute them into the Red Sea to their own demise. In the time that remains, I wanted to also make another point. A friend of mine in Andrews was writing a paper, and he was trying to study this question of hardening hearts. And he went and he found that this word for harden, there's 3 different words. One of them is this word kabad or kabed. And that has the meaning to make heavy. And in ancient Egyptian religion, they had this idea called the Book of the Dead. It wasn't a single book. It was a number of different scrolls that, when you compile them, became the Book of the Dead. And it teaches that when a person died, the god Anubis would take the heart, put it in a jar, and carry it with the person into the underworld. And they would put the jar onto a scale, and on the other side there would be a feather that represented all that was true and good and the right way to live one's life. And then he would hold the scale, and if the heart was heavier than the feather, that would represent that you'd done horrible things in your life, that you've been weighed in the balances, if you were. And the person, the deceased, would then be devoured by this monster called the Devourer. And there's a picture here in this hieroglyphic. You'll see that there's the balances here, and you can see Anubis holding the scale. And there's this thing that's got a crocodile's head that looks also like a pig and a lion, I think, on the back. And it's waiting there, getting ready to consume the person into never existing again. And if your heart is there and it weighs equal to the feather, then there was, I think, Horeb that would bring you into this room on the far right where you would then live the rest of your afterlife in the presence of Osiris and his sisters Isis and Nephthys. So there's an idea of a judgment in Egyptian. And I think perhaps this shows that the culture wasn't so corrupt that they didn't have a picture of what would happen in the afterlife, that eventually they would stand and they would be accountable for the actions that they had lived in this life. And if you guys remember, there was that god that was the serpent that swallowed up 7 other serpents. He was supposed to be one of the gods that oversaw this ritual. You'll see at the top they have 42 different gods that are observing it. But in the Bible, we're taught that there's one God that's going to oversee this final judgment. And everybody's going to stand accountable for what they had done. And one thing that I found interesting, they said that in one of the scrolls, there was actually a spell where there was a certain thing that would happen where you could have something that would try to plead mercy or hide the horrible things that you had done when it comes to judgment. And when I was thinking about that while I was studying, it's like, oh, wow, well, these wicked kings were trying to find somebody that would cover up all the horrible things that they had done. But as I'm thinking about it now, I'm like, wow, maybe even in ancient Egypt, even though it's not portrayed clearly here, whether it was through the influence of Joseph or the Hebrew nation, perhaps there was already, even before the first books of the Bible had been written on paper, some verbal tradition, some hope that there would eventually be a mediator that could stand and could hide the things that we had done in this life. So in the judgment, even though we were guilty, even though there's no hope that any one of us could ever come to stand in those balances, there was some hope for that. I'm not saying that the Egyptian religion is true, but I'm saying that perhaps even in that old ancient culture, God was still trying to show a shadowy way of redemption even to these people here. All right, we have 2 minutes left. Any last thoughts or comments before we wrap up? Yes?
I think that because the Israelites have been 400 years under slavery, maybe not the full 400, but a lot of years under slavery, and had been inundated with all these gods. I'm not saying they'd lost sight of their God, but they'd lost sight of a lot of
It's true.
what their God represents. And you know, and I know, by beholding you become changed. And I think even though they still worship their God, they had looked at all these other gods, and a lot of that had rubbed off. And I think God needed to present to them, because he sees the big picture. And I've often thought that maybe the plagues were really for them. You know, in other words, they needed to see what kind of God they really had.
Right.
To see that he was in their corner, and what he was presenting was for their good. And so they had a lot of growing to do, as you see. I mean, they wandered 40 years in the wilderness because of it, you know.
Good
That's my
points.
thought.
Good points. Thank you. Any other closing comments?
Just trying to bring it down to practical things today. God was showing the impotency or the futility of worshiping, those gods. And you look at them, the span that it covers, the sky, the water, the land, the animals, the plants, the whatever, the human body, their family. We're guilty of the same thing. We put those same things, whether we like things from the sun. We worship the sun, we worship our bodies, we worship, animals, pets, whatever it may be, earthly things that are false as well, that we are practicing idolatry like the Egyptians were, and we put them ahead of God.
Great points. All right, let's pray. Father, we've looked at a constitutional moment for the Hebrews. And this is a core part of their identity, remembering this time when there were plagues. And I think that, as some of us have spoken, that the plagues were for everybody. It was for the Egyptians, it was for the other nations, it was for the Hebrews, and probably it's for us as well. Let us be encouraged by this to take a look at our own lives, at what gods we have in our own lives, and perhaps like the members of Pharaoh's court, we can heed the warnings that you've given us, the opportunities that you've given us for us to say, I want to align myself with God's side. And I want to, when God calls his children out, I want to be in that mixed multitude. As we see clearer manifestations of your long suffering, your patience, your mercy, and your love, let our hearts be softened and not hardened, so that when you come, we will be able to hear your voice and be with you forever. I pray these things in your name. Amen. Thank you all. There's a couple of extra spare handouts here if anybody wants one. I'll linger here for another minute.